Good evening. I'm David Norton. I work at Montgomery Bell Academy in the facility department. I am not a professor. I do not teach history. I'm an amateur historian. I do not get paid. A professional gets paid. I do this because I love it, and I'm trying to find out more about it. We're going to start off with looking at some things that we know happened that day. Well, technical difficulties right off the bat. Mark's not here yet. Let me start that over again. Here we go. We were changing slides at the last minute, and it didn't change with us. There we go. Y'all know Kennedy was shot while riding in a motorcade in an open limousine. Connally was severely wounded while riding in that same limousine. The single bullet theory. This is not in order for some reason. Y'all know that Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder, and he was also arrested for shooting a patrolman, J.D. Tippit. Well, the Warren Commission had a problem with the timing, because the timing had to be, it took a certain amount of time to take a shot. You had to first acquire your target in the scope, pull the trigger, cock the rifle back, reacquire your target, fire again. And the closest they could do that without even allowing time for aiming was under 2.8 seconds. And the Zapruder film, the camera that he used was like a clock, because it did 18.3 seconds, 18.3 frames per second. So we have a clock that we know how long that should have taken. Now, if I can find the missing slide, here we go, we're going to get close to there. I had some out of order, apparently. And here is what we all heard.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Could you hear his voice break when he made that announcement? So the manhunt quickly focused on two areas. One, the Texas School Book Depository building. And if you look at the window right here, see the window's barely open, about a foot? That's the alleged window that Oswald shot out of. The book depository windows. The window sill is about this high off the floor. So there were some witnesses who said they saw Oswald and another man standing in the window. They would have seen their knees. He had to be on the floor to make that shot, kneeling on the floor. The other area was the grassy knoll. And the theory is, one theory is that the gunman was standing right about there on that grassy knoll, fired the fatal headshot. 2 days later, of course, we all saw, well, those of us who were alive back then, saw Oswald killed on TV by Jack Ruby.
Fired by a man wearing a black hat, a brown coat, a man that everyone down here thought was a Secret Service agent. Oswald was moved immediately from the area. No one knows at this time where Lee Harold Oswald is.
Lee Harold Oswald.
Where he is, an ambulance is being ready to take Oswald away. We can hear sirens outside, and an ambulance apparently is moving down now into the basement. Here comes the ambulance. And Oswald will be removed now. The ambulance is being pulled up in front of us here. Here, someone has...
We can see now that police are coming off the airplane in the basement of Dallas City Hall, hemming them off so that Lee Oswald can be taken to an ambulance, which was just brought into the basement of the City Hall. Switching now to Bob Popeye.
Oswald will be moved quickly outside, and the only word so far is that the shot came from a man wearing a black hat and a coat. Here comes Oswald. He is ashen and unconscious at this time, now being moved in. He's not moving. He's in the ambulance now, and attendants, police are quickly climbing in. They're now having to remove the armored truck from the head of the basement entrance here. For the situation at this hour in Washington, let us go now to the White House and Robert Pierpoint.
What's ironic about that clip is that they said it was a man with a black hat. Every police officer in the basement knew Jack Ruby. He gave them free passes to his clubs. He was a police groupie by all standards. So as a result of the unknown, Johnson called for a commission which became known as the Warren Commission. Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice at that time of the Supreme Court, did not want to serve as the chairman, but Johnson put the lean on him and he could be very persuasive. They concluded that Oswald acted alone, no conspiracy. Their final report was released in '64. Well, in September of '77, in response to rising public discord, and also there was an episode of, what was that guy's name? Found the vault in the wall. Geraldo Rivera, his show. They showed the Zapruder film for the first time to the public. So they established the House Select Committee. They concluded that shots were fired from 2 locations, which would necessitate a conspiracy, and urged further investigation. There was a motorcycle in the motorcade that was right behind and to the left on the driver's side of the limousine, and the microphone was stuck in the own position, so it transmitted the sound of the shots. Later, they did a study. They put microphones all over Dealey Plaza, and they analyzed the recording, and they could pinpoint where the shots they thought came from. 3 of the shots came from the rear. 1 shot came from the front. The House Select Committee concluded the shot from the front missed, but it was still a shot from a different location. There were problems later with the audio evidence, so they closed funding on any further investigations at that time. See if I can do this right without messing this up. So we're going to show the Zapruder film, and the warning is that there are graphic images presented. If you don't want to see them, you can cover your eyes, leave the room, whichever. All right. I've got to go off this. I got to go escape. I got to go down to my symbol right there. There we go. All right. There it goes. See, Kennedy is unshot, unharmed. Goes behind the freeway sign. When he comes out, he's got his arms up. Connolly is turning around saying, "What happened?" Connolly turns back around, trying to look the other way. Here comes the headshot. Head snaps back to the rear, to the left. How many of you have seen that before? Most of you, okay. This is a close-up version. Kennedy waving. Now we'll go back to the I temporarily lost it there. There we go. Okay, the magic bullet. Okay, magic bullet with Commission Exhibit 399 was found on John Connolly's. I want to go to full screen. There you go. What would we do without Mark? This was found on a hospital stretcher. They said that it was found on Connolly's stretcher. That was necessary to prove the magic bullet theory, that if it came out of Kennedy, it couldn't have gone through both of them, and it would have ended up on Connolly's stretcher, not Kennedy's stretcher. They decided that this bullet went through both Kennedy and Connolly, causing 7 wounds and breaking rib and wrist bones in Connolly. So this is a picture of, you can see Kennedy sitting in the back seat, Connolly in the front. You can see the angle of the bullet. It was in his collar, in the jacket, almost 6 inches below the collar. We're going to demonstrate this in just a second. Then it came out near the knot of his tie in the front, entered Connolly's back, came out, went into his thigh. There's a few more twists and turns though, so I need some volunteers. I need a president, I need a governor, and if I had the wives of each, that would help. You guys? Great. Come on up. I need 2 people and 2 people to hold the angles for me.
Where are we sitting?
Okay. I want, how tall are you?
Like that.
How tall are you? Okay. Why don't you sit on the crank right there? Back seat. You're the president. Why don't you sit in front of him? I'll need one more volunteer. Anybody that wants to go. Okay. Now then.
Oh.
Let's see. All right. You would come over here. I'm going to have you hold these rods are to simulate the angles of the bullets. Okay. So I want you to hold this rod. I'm going to show you where to hold it. Angles will do that. See if we can come right here to his back. We're going to hold this at a 25-degree angle. We can get on this chair. Go right about there. The angle, that's the angle you're going right there. If you can hold it with both hands, you won't lose that angle. And I will pinpoint where it goes on his shirt, okay? It'll be 6 inches down from his collar. And if this was a sport coat like Kennedy was wearing, it would be turned down, so we'll go from there, right about this point. Right there, and keep your angle about the same. About 20 degrees. That's about right. Okay, that's the bullet from the 6th floor window of the book depository. Now then, you like jumpers? I have another bullet. Came out of Kennedy's throat. You can hold that in his throat. And because we don't know the angle level, we're going to assume it's about the same angle. In fact, let's put it about like that. Okay? Which is a little better than they were saying. Now then, you're going to be, I didn't have a 10-gallon hat, so you just have to pretend you're holding a 10-gallon hat in your right hand. So you're holding a 10-gallon hat, right? And the bullet is going to come under, went in under his armpit in the back, came out under the right nipple, went into this wrist, so just kind of hold it like that, okay? And then it ended up, it deflected after it hit the bone, and ended up in his left thigh, like that. Now, the problem is, one of the problems, or many problems, is this angle right here. If this bullet is coming in at this angle, what would make it stop, come up, come out at this angle? And then what would make the bullet coming through finally? Well, we know it angled because it broke ribs and it broke his wrist bone and then ended up in his left thigh. So, I'll hold that for just one more second, okay? And then we'll turn it loose. So if you look at the, this is an indication of what we're seeing here. The path, if you can see the turn right here, a little more graphic. Now this is the bullet. Okay, y'all can rest now. Thank you. Let's give him a hand. So this is the bullet that they said did all this damage to both the president and the governor. This is Commission Exhibit 399. It's nearly a pristine bullet. You can see on the bullet the slight dip right there. And then the next picture you'll see the base where it's got a deformity and a little bit of material removed. That material was removed to make a spectrographic analysis. So now we're going to look at that bullet next to the bullets that went through, they fired them through the wrists of cadavers. Look at the deformity of those bullets. Yet this bullet came out pristine. Don't think so. This is another slide that demonstrates the clock of the camera running, and it shows the steps where you've got to take the first shot. It shows Connally turning left, Kennedy reacting. Connally's finally hit down here. It's not enough seconds to have operated the bolt, fired the gun, not to mention aiming through the scope. If you're shooting through a scope, once you fire, you've got to reacquire the target. You've got to find the target. The target was moving downhill and slightly to the right away from him. About the length of a football field was the fatal shot, if it came from the depository. We just did that. Now my slides are back on track. Okay, the lone assassin theory, of course, this is what the Warren Commission supported, was that Oswald acted alone. They said he had the motive, means, and opportunity. Well, he had no motive. He and his wife liked the Kennedys and spoke highly of them. He had no means. The rifle was in poor condition, and he was a poor shot. The rifle scope was in such a bad position that they had to take it off the gun and shim it and put it back on to get it where they could even fire the gun and have a reasonable hope of hitting the target. Oswald, when he was in the Marine Corps, attained the level of marksman, which is the lowest level that you can pass on. He was known to be a poor shot, and they often teased him about all the mulligans where he hit not the target at all. He was never known to practice. Any competitive sport, including shooting, you've got to practice on a regular basis to be any good. He was never seen practicing. And he didn't have an opportunity to commit the crime if he was not on the 6th floor at the time the motorcade passed. A woman who worked at the depository saw him on the 2nd floor in the lunchroom about 30 seconds before the motorcade went by. She went outside. After the shots were fired, Roy Truley, who was the manager of the depository and a police officer went inside. They went up to the second floor and saw Oswald in the lunchroom drinking a Coke. Truly said, yeah, that man works here, he's okay. So they left. Oswald did not look like he had just run down 6 flights of steps. Oswald, we could spend the whole night on. There's a lot that we don't know about Oswald. Where there were two sightings. For example, there was one in Mexico at the embassy while there was another one working in Dallas. One, Oswald went to the car dealership, said he was going to be coming into a lot of money soon, took the salesman on a ride that scared him to death, taking corners on 2 wheels and everything. The only problem with that was that Oswald didn't know how to drive and didn't have a license. Ruth Payne was teaching him. He was also seen at a rifle range in Irving. He kept shooting at another man's target. When the man complained, he said, "I'm Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'll shoot at whatever I please." Again, trying to establish a pattern. And that was the only time that we knew him to practice, that one instance. I mentioned a while ago, he was seen at the Cuban embassy, but the photo doesn't match. The photo is a man much heavier and different complexion, different hair color. The height of two Oswalds also, they exhumed Oswald's body in '84 because they weren't certain if it was the real Oswald or not. There were 2 different heights, 5'9" and 5'11", on the different forms that he used throughout his life. They decided that the Oswald in the grave was the real Oswald, though. He was stationed when he was in the Marine Corps at Asugi Air Force Base. The U-2 planes flew out of there, and he had top secret clearance. He worked with the radar systems. While he was there, he caught venereal disease, and the medical report said it was in the line of duty. And I can't quite figure that out, if that's a spy work or what. After discharge, he was very dissatisfied with the American way of life. He said he was a Marxist. So he defected to the Soviet Union, and he offered them secrets. And shortly after that, the only time a U-2 was shot down, Gary Powers was the pilot. The speculation is that Oswald gave them information they needed to find where the U-2s were flying, because they hadn't been able to find them before that. But he became homesick, and he asked to return home, so his passport was returned to him immediately, and the State Department even loaned him money to come back and welcomed him home with open arms. That just doesn't happen when you've defected your country. So he got the job at the Texas Book Depository on October 15th. Ruth Payne was complaining that Oswald needed a job, and her neighbor heard her and said, "Oh, well, my brother just got a job there at the book depository. You ought to go try that out." And the motorcade route was published in the newspaper, Dallas newspapers, on November 19th. When he left that morning, it was a Thursday. Normally went home on Fridays and stayed the weekend, but this was a Thursday. He rode back Thursday night to Irving. He left his ring and most of his cash, about $200. It's hard to plan an escape on $15 in your wallet. And we talked about that a minute ago. So now the conspiracies. I just had to do that. Khrushchev actually liked JFK, respected him, and they were working to bring about the end of the Cold War. They were trying to meet. Kennedy made a very important speech June 1st at the American University and talked about his desires to end the Cold War. And both he and Khrushchev knew there's no winning of modern war. Especially if you use nuclear weapons, nobody wins. The Cuban exiles, another group that was upset with JFK. The lack of support that the CIA did not provide in the Bay of Pigs, they blamed it on Kennedy. They wanted more support to remove Castro. The CIA actually was involved in several plots to kill Castro, but JFK tried to stop those. He had already initiated discussions. He wanted to reestablish relations with Cuba, which is what Obama had done recently. And he was very serious about ending the Cold War, and that was one way to do it. The right-wing extremists, this is a broad group. They disagreed with the liberal views of both Kennedys. They wanted more favors for big oil, concessions and allotments, and the price fixing was a big problem that they were trying to get. He was afraid of the Kennedy dynasty. If Kennedy had not been shot, he would have easily probably won a re-election in '64. So you'd have Kennedy JFK for 8 years, Robert Kennedy for 8 years, and good old Teddy for 8 years. They wanted control of the banks and the money policies. They liked LBJ and his rather conservative agenda. They had their man in power. One thing about LBJ was that when Eisenhower was still president and Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader, he was arguably the most powerful man in the country because he controlled the flow of the legislation. He controlled what was brought to the floor, what was not brought to the floor. If you weren't his friend, you were his enemy. He made life difficult. And Eisenhower was content to let him run his program because Eisenhower was slowly bowing out, getting ready to retire. So the mafia and Jimmy Hoffa, a lot of people have thought that they were involved. They helped Joe Kennedy deliver votes in Illinois, which gave the race narrowly to JFK. I think he was heard to say that he wasn't going to pay for a landslide. When Robert Kennedy got into office and became the Attorney General, he unleashed a vendetta unlike anything they'd ever seen before, prosecuting the mafia, going after Jimmy Hoffa. They were understandably upset. He even deported Carlos Marcella, who was the leader of the New Orleans faction. There were phone conversations that they recorded, and the records have now, that says Marcella was telling others in the mafia that Kennedy was going to be hit. And he was really maddest at Robert Kennedy, but they said, to stop the tail of the dog from wagging, you cut off the head. Hoover, by the way, insisted the mafia did not exist. He was more afraid of communists than the mafia. Hoover had been told by JFK that he was going to be forced to retire after the next election. He told Dallas agent James Hosty to destroy the files that they had on Lee Harvey Oswald. He agreed with LBJ that the Warren Commission should attempt to prove that Oswald was a lone suspect and suppress any other information. The Warren Commission set out with one goal, not to seek the truth, but to prove that Oswald did it acting alone. The FBI was also paying Oswald, as was the CIA. They knew of Oswald before the motorcade, but they didn't think he was a threat. Gerald Ford, remember him? He was the plant for Hoover and the FBI on the Warren Commission. And the FBI is known to have withheld crucial information from the Warren Commission. For example, they interviewed a lot of people and never turned in those interviews, never turned that paperwork over. There were people they should have interviewed, and they never did interview them. They didn't want to talk to them because their viewpoint, what they had seen, witnessed, did not agree with the party line of the Warren Commission. For example, they confiscated a lot of cameras in Dealey Plaza that day and took a lot of film. Some people think the Zapruder film was tampered with. There are splices that we can tell, like at the first of the Zapruder, when the limousine should be coming around the corner, you don't see anything, you see the motorcycles, then all of a sudden it appears. But there's no actual changing of the film in terms of what it shows for Kennedy's shots. And I think if they were going to do anything to it, since they couldn't really change that part, I think they would have just destroyed it so there wouldn't be any evidence. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Eisenhower had warned about the military-industrial complex. The Cold War was to their advantage because of all the money they could make. The generals argued with Kennedy and lost. They thought he was soft on communism, but he was really trying to put a bridge there to end the Cold War. Some of them had been fired by JFK. Secret Service, oh boy. They ignored training and protocols for protecting Lancer. That was JFK's code name. They chose an unnecessary, unsafe route to Trade Mart. If you've been to Dallas and been through Dealey Plaza, Elm Street, the main street comes through, Elm Street comes on this side, Commerce on this side, and they're one way opposite each other. And if you go down Elm Street, you can get onto the freeway. If you go down Main Street, there's a concrete curb. It's about this high, and you can't cross over that curb to get onto the interstate. So they were saying they chose that route because he had to turn right and then turn left, which means they came to almost a complete stop in front of the Texas Book School Depository, and then they were going about 11 miles an hour as they pulled away from the depository. If they had gone on Main Street and gone down to Industrial Boulevard, they could have turned right and gone right up to the Trade Mart. They requested no help from Dallas Police Department for Dealey Plaza, and they had nobody stationed in Dealey Plaza. After the shots were fired, people ran up on the grassy knoll and confronted a man who was up there. He pulled out identification, said, "I'm Secret Service," so they left him alone. Secret Service said later, "We didn't have anybody up there." They changed the normal order of the motorcade. Normally, the motorcycles would be in front of the motorcade and beside it and behind it in a flanking position. All the motorcycles, there were 5 at the very front of the parade, then the pilot car, then Kennedy's limousine, and the motorcycles were behind him, and then everybody else. And they put the press bus much farther back than they normally do, so they wouldn't have a view of what was going on. They were out partying the night before in Fort Worth till 2 and 3 in the morning, and they were heard to exclaim, I'm not going to read that, but you can read it. There were only 2 agents that responded at all. One was Clint Hill. He's you've seen him climbing onto the trunk of the car. Jackie Kennedy is trying to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull, and he helped her get back down the seat, and then he laid on top of them, which he was supposed to do. But he was her agent, not Kennedy's agent. Rufus Youngblood, pushed LBJ and Ladybird to the floor of their car and laid across them. Only 2 agents of all the agents there responded. And the limousine, I don't know if you noticed on the Zapruder film, but it actually slows down. Some people say it even stopped on Elm Street before the fatal shot, and then it sped away. When Kennedy was shot in '63, it was not a federal crime to kill the president. So the Dallas Police Department, Dallas District Attorney had jurisdiction in the case. Well, the Secret Service said, we're taking this body back to Dallas. And at gunpoint, literally at gunpoint, they took the body out of the hospital and took it to the plane. They failed to protect JFK when he was there. Okay, Dallas Police Department. They failed to cover Dealey Plaza. They were asked by the Secret Service, told they didn't need to cover Dealey Plaza. They failed to protect JFK and Lee Harvey Oswald when he was in their custody. They failed to control the crime scenes. The book depository, the Dealey Plaza, the hospital, the limousine, all that was evidence and should have been confiscated, controlled. They failed to control the evidence. In this case, I know that in a lot of police cases, things come up missing or things might get mislabeled, get lost in the evidence room. But in this case, almost every single piece of evidence, almost every one, was either tampered with, lost, chain of possession broken where it couldn't be proven. For example, Nellie Conley took John Conley's clothes home and washed them before she turned them over to the commission. Dallas police should have had possession of those clothes. The limousine that Kennedy rode in was taken immediately to Detroit, stripped and refurbished before anybody could analyze it for bullets, anything like that. There were some fragments found. So everything was a mess. And I'll tell you in just a minute, okay, Oswald, his rights were withheld. Now, some people say, well, Miranda should have protected him, but Miranda didn't start till 1966. So this was before Miranda, but he still had the rights to an attorney and certain other things. When they gave this lineup, Oswald had been beaten up because he resisted arrest. He had a bloody cut over his right eye. He had a black eye, and he was wearing a dirty T-shirt. The other men in the lineup, one of them had a sports jacket on. One of them, I think, actually had a tie on. They did not look anything like him. They looked fairly respectable, and he looked like he'd been on the run. So the people that might have picked him in the lineup, he said it was not a fair shake. And the fingerprinting, when he was fingerprinted, it was late at night. They did it about 3 different times. But they also did a paraffin test to see if he had fired a rifle. A paraffin test is where they make a mask of your face, and then when they peel that off and analyze it under a certain light, and it detects the presence of nitrates, which means if you fired a gun, there's going to be nitrate deposits on your face. Well, the paraffin test for his face came back negative or false, meaning he had not fired a gun according to that. But the test for his hands came back positive. Well, we think the reason for that is that they did the paraffin test 10 hours after they arrested him. It was 9 o'clock at night. And they had just fingerprinted him for the third time. And the fingerprint ink, they think, may have caused the positive reading on his hands. And it's just as likely the false reading on his face could have been caused by the length of time that transpired. So, again, a botched job. Probably the biggest mistake they made was they published the transfer time from the city to county jail where Oswald, as you saw when he was shot. People knew the transfer time. And Ruby, we're going to get to him in just a second, but Ruby was over an hour late for that transfer time. Well, the speculation was, how did Ruby, he'd been at the Western Union sending a cablegram to one of his strippers, sending them money, and then he came to the police station, walked down the ramp, and was in position just in time to shoot Oswald. Well, a theory about that is that Oswald wasn't brought out till they knew that Ruby was in place. So that's why it was over an hour late. They were waiting for Ruby, not the other way around. When Oswald was arrested at the Texas Theater, he was arrested for entering the theater without a ticket. 12 squad cars responded to that theater for that arrest. And they were heard to say as they arrested him, "Kill the president, will you?" Jacob Rubenstein, had mafia connections, mainly from Chicago. He was ordered to kill Oswald. He staked out the police department all weekend, but people were used to seeing him there because, like I said, he was a groupie. He was always hanging around the police station. He was an hour late to enter the basement. We talked about that. The car horn honked twice. I don't know if you heard that when you saw the video. He told the Warren Commission that he could not talk in Dallas, but he had a lot to tell them. And he said, "If you take me to Washington, I can tell you what you need to know." He said, "If you leave me here, I'll die soon." And he did. He died of cancer about 2 years later. LBJ, possibly going to be dropped from the ticket in '64. Never would have been president any other way. Didn't like Kennedy, either one of them. He was real good friends with J. Edgar Hoover. There were fingerprints of an associate of his, Mac Wallace, were found in the Texas Book Depository on the 6th floor. What does that mean? He would have returned to position of power after being vice president and having none. He was publicly heard to say his reason for the Warren Commission was that he was afraid that Russia was behind a plot and he didn't want the nation to get caught up in that. So he thought the best way to put an end to the rumors was to form a commission to prove that Oswald did it, acting alone. The CIA. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he threatened to bust them up into 1,000 pieces and throw it to the wind. He fired Allen Dulles as the head of CIA, and he ended up later on the Warren Commission. How about that? And Charles Cabell, the brother of Earl Cabell, who was the mayor of Dallas, had also been fired. They were also paying Oswald. The rogue operations in the CIA, there's multiple levels in an agency like that. And the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing for protection. They don't want to know. They needed the war machine profits that Vietnam would bring. Kennedy had already said he had already ordered the pull out of the first 1,000 troops and was going to quickly try to bring an end to our involvement there. E. Howard Hunt, who was also part of the Watergate burglary team, on his deathbed said that the CIA arranged the murder of Kennedy. There are documents that we have found that the CIA issued where they told authors how to, people writing reviews of books, how to discredit the authors of the conspiracy theories, how to make them look bad. Witnesses. There were several witnesses that died within a very short time period of the crime happening. The odds against that, in the book Executive Action that was written in '73, A London actuary calculated the odds were 100 trillion to 1 against that many people dying that soon. Well, the House Select Committee got hold of that and said that can't be right, and they had another actuary figure it, and he said, actually that wasn't right at all. It wasn't 100 trillion to 1, it was only 100 billion to 1. So, but there were a lot of strange deaths, including several people who were set to testify. George de Mohrenschildt, who was the CIA person who was running Oswald, the night before he was going to testify, he apparently committed suicide. They wanted it to look that way. He shot himself 5 times. There was just a host of witnesses that died strangely. There were 5 FBI leaders who were going to testify, and they all died within like a week of their testimony. There was also foreknowledge of the crime. You may have heard of Rose Cheramy. Rose Cheramy would not have been a good witness in any court case because of her background. She was a drug runner. She was a prostitute. She was an addict. She was being forced to carry drugs from Brownsville, Texas, to Houston to Dallas. They were holding her daughter until she completed the job. She got run over by a car and left for dead. They took her to the hospital. This was in Louisiana. Took her to the hospital, and she said, when she came to, she said, "You've got to stop them. They're on the way to kill the president." They said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "They're on the way, those men I was riding with, they're on the way to Dallas to kill the president." Well, that's fine and good if it had happened afterwards, but this happened November 20th, 2 days before the assassination. They said, well, she's just delirious, and, you know, they sedated her, and she checked out of the hospital 2 days later. When the doctor saw what had happened, he called the FBI and said, "You might want to talk to this woman." Well, they weren't interested. They didn't care. But that was foreknowledge of the crime that was documented. So what do we do now? It occurred a long time ago, 53 years ago. Most, if not all, the principals are dead, probably for a long time now. Does it really matter anymore? Last year was the first year that I remember that in the media, like in the newspaper, when it said this happened in history this day, it was not mentioned at all last year. The TV specials that you see on TV that claim to have solved the crime or talk about who did it, I haven't seen any of them listed this year yet. But the ones that were out a few years ago, you will notice that they do not show the Zapruder film and they do not show the head snap. They show a simulation with computer models, and it does not line up the right way. But they won't show the head snap because that's too damning. NOAA is a science program that I used to have a lot of respect for. They did a test to show that a bullet from the rear could cause a head to snap back. They took a goat skull and filled it with gelatin and set it on top of a stepladder, fired a rifle from behind it, and it toppled backwards off the ladder. So they said, well, there you go. A head could snap backwards from a shot from the rear. Of course, that goat skull was not attached by a spine and muscles and bone to a human body. It could happen again. Do y'all know about the 20-year curse? There was a curse on the presidential elections. Those elected in years that ended in even numbers, going back to, let's see, I guess it started back before Lincoln. Every 20 years, that president died in office. Guess who broke the curse? Kennedy said he was going to break the curse when he came into office, but guess who broke it finally? Reagan. So why it still matters? It's still the crime of that century, and there's no statute of limitations on murder. Since that assassination, there's been other elections influenced by gunplay. For example, Kennedy most likely would have been the winner in '64. Robert Kennedy would have won in '68 if he had not been shot. George Wallace might have gotten enough votes to throw the '68 election. We had a very spirited election this year. Even though it was largely uncivil, it did not result in the violence that it could have resulted in. We've got to bind our wounds and agree to work side by side, not head to head. We must rely on ballots, not bullets, to decide our common fate. So yes, indeed, it matters very much what happened 53 years ago. We should demand the answers to our questions and never accept that we can't be told because we don't need to know or can't handle the truth. We cannot handle lies and disinformation fed to us by the media or our government. What do? We vote, we attend civic events, go to government meetings, get involved, urge others to do the same thing. Never accept choice by violence or fear. Now, if there's any questions, I'd like to take questions.
Do you think there exists somewhere the answer that we all want to hear, but it's just not being revealed to us?
I do.
Where do you think it is?
I think it's in the records somewhere, probably in the CIA's records. Y'all know what red acting means? When the government, sometimes when they release a form that's been classified secret, you'll have a piece of paper and it'll be full of type, but there'll be big black sections through it where you can't read anything. Some of the records that have been released look like that. I mean, they have no meaning. And I have trouble with records that were made back in 53 years ago relating to national security today. Other questions? Yes.
When you're doing the model that you told, when you said that the bullet went through the back, but you know, the video looked like it hit him in the head and the skull.
Well, that was the fatal shot, the third shot. For the Warren Commission's version to work, the second shot had to go through, had to be the shot that hit both Kennedy and Connally. The third shot, which we think came from the front, is what exploded Kennedy's head. There's also a difference. The back wound on Kennedy's back, when they probed it at the autopsy, it only went in a finger's depth. And they said that very likely that bullet fell out. Well, I think that was the pristine bullet that fell out. But they were not allowed to, at the autopsy, they were not allowed to dissect Kennedy's chest and open it up and explore the muscles in the neck or anything to see if the bullet did come out. Also, in Parkland Hospital, when they brought him in trying to save his life, they noticed a small round puncture wound in his throat, and they did a tracheotomy right through that. So they obliterated the evidence of the wound, trying to save his life. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that Oswald's body was exhumed
Mhm.
to verify that he was who they thought he was. And it sounds like you don't feel like they did a thorough autopsy of JFK. So has anybody tried to exhume his body?
They've talked about it, but the Kennedy family won't allow it. I doubt that I doubt that would ever happen, unless some evidence of something else came to light that was particularly damning. Kennedy's brain is missing. It went missing right after the autopsy, and they think the Kennedy family has it or arranged for it to be destroyed. Kennedy's casket was opened at Arlington Cemetery right before he was buried. The family wanted to see him one last time, and they opened his casket there. Any other questions? Clay.
What do you think is most likely in terms of you mentioned several different parties that may have an interest. So to the extent you have an opinion about.
My opinion is this. Everybody did it. And by that I mean you had the government who may not have been directly involved, but they were involved in the cover-up. Obstruction of justice after the fact. You had groups like the Cuban exiles who wanted to be involved, but probably didn't have the means to be involved. But you had all these different factions that had reasons to get Kennedy, who want to get Kennedy. The CIA were fairly certain where it was involved. We've got deathbed confessions, we've got files that have been released, different things. CIA, the money, the big oil, the money, the extreme right wing, their money interest, it all ties together. in this sordid kind of concoction. So I think it was a group. It was not, you might say, well, he said the U.S. government did it. I don't think the U.S. government did it. I think the U.S. government, after it was done, said, oh, we can't let people know what really happened, so we're going to cover this up. I think that's how it started. And people have said, well, surely somebody would have talked after all this time. Well, a lot of people were under gag orders. A lot of people were threatened. Some people have talked. So there's all kinds of theories about the body being altered and 2 caskets and, the follow-up Secret Service car accidentally fired the fatal shot, or the driver turned around and fired the fatal shot. There's all kinds of theories and stuff that are really off the wall. We went to a bookstore. My son lives in Sedona. We went to a bookstore last Christmas in Flagstaff, and as we went in, the doors said normal and paranormal for the 2 sections of the bookstore. So guess where the Kennedy books were? In the paranormal section. So I started looking through one of the books, and I thought, well, this doesn't look too extreme, And I read on the back of the book about the author, and it said that he was living on Saturn most of the year and came to Earth just going on and on like that. It was really bizarre. So you got to be careful what you read. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think that's part of a plot either to make people look silly who believe in conspiracies or something. I got to finish with a joke. Vincent Bugliosi wrote a book called History Reclaimed. It's about 1,600 pages, weighs about 8 pounds. It's a slugger to get through. I forced myself to read it. I finally had to make myself read 30 pages a night to get through it because I didn't think I was ever going to finish it. It's full of bad logic and bad reasoning and all kinds of junk, but it has one good part at the very end. There's a joke that I've always appreciated, and it goes kind of like this. There's a group of JFK assassination researchers who die, and they go to heaven together, and they're in a big room waiting for God to interview them. God comes in and they say, okay, at last, please tell us what happened in Dallas. Who helped Oswald? God looks them squarely in the eye and says, how many times do I have to tell you guys? Oswald did it acting alone. God leaves the room. They look at each other. It goes higher than we thought. Thank you. Yes. Sure.
Did the Warren Commission say that there was only one bullet, or did they acknowledge, how did they deal with
They said there were 3 shots. The first shot missed, and there was a bystander there's Elm, Maine, over on Commerce, and the bullet hit him, so it missed by wide range. And that was James Tagg, and the first bullet hit him. The second bullet allegedly shot both Kennedy and Connally, and the third bullet hit Kennedy in the head, the fatal shot. They think Oswald fired all 3 shots. The rifle that was found in the book depository had been purchased by mail by Oswald. It was a 1940-something model Mannlicher Carcano, which is an Italian rifle. The joke in the Italian army was that that rifle killed more Italians than the Germans did. It was prone to misfire. It wasn't very accurate. It was a cheap weapon. He paid about $12.75, I think, for the weapon. And it was really in bad shape. Wasn't kept up, wasn't maintained. He never practiced. I mean, the shots he made, nobody has been able to duplicate those shots. They have fired at stationary targets and hit them. They fired in a situation where time was no matter. They could take as long as they wanted, and they hit 2 out of 3. But nobody could duplicate the effort that he supposedly did. And he only brought 4 bullets with him. Other question? Andy?
What's Ted Cruz's dad's role in all that?
I have no idea. Dealey Plaza was full of all these people who, like the Umbrella Man. He raised his umbrella when Kennedy came by. and then put it down. Some people said that was a sign to shoot, and the House Select Committee interviewed him, and he had the umbrella and brought it to the committee, and as he started to raise it up, they said, wait a minute, that's not going to shoot at us or anything, is it? But he said it was just a protest of Kennedy's policies. And people have said that Kennedy was shot from the manhole in the street. Well, they've gotten actually down in the manhole and looked, and there's no way you could have got an angle of fire that would work, but they've tried to explore everything. I met Mark Lane when I lived in Dallas. I met Mark Lane in Dealey Plaza, and he was shooting a documentary for the BBC, and we talked at length, and he said, you know, that he actually had known Kennedy, so it was nice to talk to him. But that was when that was in '77, I guess, and he said at that point it was the CIA, and he proved it later. He's got books that talk about there was a civil case brought because the CIA was bringing a civil case against a woman who said in an article that the CIA was behind the assassination of Kennedy. They filed a libel suit, and they lost. Mark Lane represented her, and they lost the suit. So you had a civil court that was kind of implying that CIA had been behind Kennedy's assassination. E. Howard Hunt couldn't remember where he was that day. He was in Dallas. And of course, you've got to be careful of the off-the-wall theories. Like Nixon was seen leaving Dallas that morning. He was a private attorney working for Pepsi-Cola after he lost the election, and he was seen leaving Dallas at Love Field that morning. People go, "Oh, Nixon was in Dallas," you know, but they were friends. Nixon and Kennedy were friends, so it had nothing to do with the assassination. He was just leaving. He was through with his work there. Other. I think the presidents have probably known, yeah. Yes. Staggering number of witnesses have been murdered. Other questions? Thanks for coming. We're at 6:30. We're right on time.